Christmas is a time for joy, for togetherness, for family. It's a season of celebration, of love, and of cherished memories. Families gather, children laugh, and homes are filled with warmth. But behind the twinkling lights and wrapped gifts, some horrors lurk. What if the jingle bells are masking something darker? What if the man in the red suit wasn't bringing joy, but death? For many, Christmas is a time of peace, of sacred traditions and cherished moments. But in the darkness of the season, there are stories that shatter that illusion. The Christmas spirit we've come to know, bright, joyful, and full of love, can sometimes hide the darkest of realities. Behind the smiles, the gifts, and the feasts, there are lives tragically altered, and some that are taken away forever. In this documentary, we delve into the darkest corners of Christmas. 5 chilling stories that span decades, with lives lost and questions unanswered. 5 victims whose families will never be the same again. These stories, woven together by the most unsettling of threads, reveal a side of Christmas that most would prefer to forget. From the brutal massacre of an innocent family to a grisly crime that remained unsolved for decades. From a killer who turned Christmas into a bloodbath to a holiday tragedy that shocked the world. What really happened? What is the truth behind these horrors that left a dark stain on the holiday season? Before we begin, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Join us as we uncover the twisted side of Christmas that most would rather ignore. It was Christmas Day, 1929, in the quiet rural community of Germantown, North Carolina. The Lawson family, like so many others, was celebrating the holiday with cheer. The snow had just begun to settle over the town, coating the roads in a soft blanket of white, and the air was crisp and cold, carrying with it the familiar scent of pine and wood smoke. The Lawson family home was no different from any other on Christmas morning. Inside, the warmth of a crackling fire filled the living room, and the scent of a holiday meal being prepared in the kitchen added to the festive atmosphere. The kids, like most children on Christmas, were excited and filled with joy, eagerly awaiting the opening of gifts. Charlie Lawson, a well-known local tobacco farmer, had worked hard throughout the year, and like any good father, he wanted to ensure that his family would have a special Christmas. To capture the joy of the season, he took his wife, Fanny, and their 7 children to a local photographer for a holiday portrait. It was a seemingly innocent family outing, one that many other families across the country were also enjoying. In the photo, the Lawson family appeared to be a picture of happiness. Parents smiling, children neatly dressed in their holiday best, all gathered together in front of the photographer's backdrop. Yet, this Christmas, instead of a holiday filled with warmth, laughter, and memories, the Lawson family would soon become victims of one of the most infamous and chilling family murders in American history. On Christmas Day 1929, Charlie Lawson, a tobacco farmer, murdered his wife, 2 sons, and 2 daughters before turning the gun on himself. The family had just come home from a Christmas photo session where they appeared to be a picture of happiness. But something dark lingered beneath the surface. The morning had started like any other Christmas morning. The Lawson family had awoken early, eager to spend the day together. They had visited the photographer's studio, taken their family portrait, and returned to their home in high spirits. To outsiders, everything appeared perfect. But what no one knew, what no one could have anticipated, was the horrifying tragedy that would unfold within the walls of their own home. Charlie Lawson, the family patriarch, had always been a quiet, private man. Known for his hard work and dedication to his farm, Charlie was generally well-liked in the small community. However, those close to him had noticed a shift in his behavior leading up to the holiday. His actions became erratic. Some whispered that he had been dealing with financial difficulties. Others said he was under an unusual amount of stress from farming debts. Still, no one could have foreseen that it would all lead to such violence. Charlie had always been known as a man of few words, but when he did speak, it was often about his love for his family. He had provided for them through years of hard work, and his love for them was clear. But in the weeks leading up to Christmas, something began to change. Friends and neighbors who saw him around town remarked that he had become distant, distracted, and even agitated at times. There were rumors of mounting debts, financial stress from his farming ventures, and the burden of raising 7 children. But those close to him didn't know the full extent of what was happening behind closed doors. There were also whispers that Charlie had been involved in a number of personal struggles that might have taken a toll on his mental health. What seemed to be a sudden explosive act of violence was in fact the culmination of a much darker undercurrent that had been building for some time. As the day went on, the Lawson family gathered together, as many families do on Christmas Day. The children played, the adults talked, and the warmth of the fire grew more comforting as the night closed in. But unbeknownst to them, something darker was lurking beneath the surface of Charlie's mind. Around 5 p.m., after a seemingly normal day, Charlie, for reasons that remain unclear, began to carry out an unimaginable act. He went to the barn and retrieved his rifle, returning to the house where his family was. It was then that the terror began. Charlie began with his wife, Fanny. She was shot in cold blood. He then went on to kill his 2 sons, Arthur and Marie, and 2 daughters, Mary Lou and Carrie. The brutality of the killings was shocking, especially since the family had been in such high spirits only hours earlier. When it was over, Charlie Lawson had murdered 5 members of his family, executing them with the rifle one by one in a chilling act of violence that took mere minutes. However, the horror did not end there. After killing his family, Charlie Lawson turned the gun on himself, taking his own life in the same manner he had taken the lives of his loved ones. The community was left in utter shock and disbelief. What could have possibly driven this man, who seemed so normal to everyone around him, to commit such a heinous act? Was it truly financial ruin that drove him over the edge? Or was there a much deeper, more personal reason behind this Christmas massacre? Despite being a well-respected member of the community, Charlie Lawson's reputation would forever be marred by the gruesome events that took place on that Christmas evening. The townspeople, who had once admired him, were left to grapple with the horrific truth of what had occurred behind the closed doors of the Lawson family home. Charlie Lawson's motives were never fully understood. The investigation revealed that no one in the family had shown any signs of being aware of Charlie's intentions. His children were left unprotected, and his wife, Fanny, had no warning of the violent end that awaited her and the children. What made the situation even more perplexing was the seemingly normal nature of the family life prior to the murders. If there had been any warning signs, if there had been any indication that something was amiss, it might have been easier to make sense of this tragedy. But the Lawson family's murder came without warning, without explanation, and without a clear understanding of what had driven Charlie to commit such an act. The circumstances surrounding the murders were chilling. The bodies were discovered by Charlie's surviving son Raymond, who had been out working in the fields and returned to the house to find the grisly scene. Raymond, who was only 16 years old at the time, was the only survivor of the massacre. He found his father's body first and immediately called the authorities, who arrived at the scene to find the blood-soaked house and the lifeless bodies of his family. The investigation into the deaths was complicated by the fact that Charlie Lawson had taken his own life. There was no one left to answer questions. Theories began to circulate. Was the murder the result of financial stress, or was it something much darker? Some speculated that Charlie had been suffering from severe depression or mental illness, while others argued that the pressures of farm life and his growing debts pushed him to a breaking point. Some even suggested that Charlie had been motivated by jealousy or bitterness, particularly toward his wife and children, but no clear answers ever emerged. The mystery surrounding Charlie Lawson's actions has haunted the small town of Germantown for decades. To this day, many questions remain unanswered. What led him to commit such a violent act on Christmas Day? Was it the financial strain, the mounting debts, or something deeper that pushed him over the edge? What was it that made a seemingly peaceful family holiday turn into one of the most infamous family murders in history? As the years have passed, the horror of that Christmas night still lingers. The town of Germantown, once filled with the sounds of children playing and neighbors talking, now carries with it the ghost of the Lawson family's tragic end. The echo of that night reverberates through the community to this day, leaving many to wonder, was Charlie Lawson a victim of his circumstances? Or was he a man driven by something much darker? It was Christmas Eve 1927, and the small town of Stockton, California, was brimming with the festive spirit. The streets were lined with twinkling lights, and families gathered together in preparation for their holiday celebrations. People were in high spirits as they made last-minute purchases and prepared for the joy of Christmas morning. The crisp winter air, combined with the scent of pine and cinnamon, added to the sense of warmth and cheer that seemed to envelop the town. The holiday season was in full swing, with everyone anticipating a peaceful and joyous night filled with laughter, food, and family. But within the walls of one building in particular, there was something far darker brewing. The Stockton Savings Bank, a small but well-known institution in the heart of town, would become the site of an event that would change the community forever. As the evening approached, few could have predicted that the very essence of Christmas would be turned upside down by a man who came dressed as none other than Santa Claus. The contrast was startling. Christmas is a time of peace, goodwill, and joy. It is a time where the warmth of family and the spirit of giving come together. But that Christmas Eve, in a quiet town in California, that festive spirit would be shattered by violence and terror. And the face of the holiday season would be marred by the image of a killer dressed as Santa Claus. On Christmas Eve, 1927, a masked man dressed as Santa Claus walked into the Stockton Savings Bank in California and opened fire. What seemed like an innocent holiday gesture quickly turned into a deadly robbery. But Santa had an even darker plan. The Christmas Eve robbery began like any other holiday moment, but quickly escalated into one of the most bizarre criminal acts of its time. At around 5:30 p.m., just as the bank was preparing to close for the night, a man dressed in a full Santa Claus costume walked through the front doors of the Stockton Savings Bank. To the unsuspecting tellers and customers inside, the man's entrance seemed harmless, perhaps even festive. After all, it was Christmas Eve, and the sight of someone in a Santa suit wasn't out of the ordinary. In fact, people had become accustomed to seeing Santa Claus during the holiday season, whether he was greeting children in a store or attending various community events. But within moments, it became clear that something was wrong. The man, who would later be referred to as the Santa Claus robber, pulled out a gun and ordered everyone to the ground. He wasn't there to spread holiday cheer, he was there to commit a violent crime. The sound of the gunshot shattered the air, instantly turning the bank from a peaceful festive setting to a scene of terror. The robber, dressed head to toe in the traditional red and white of Santa, wasn't just threatening the customers and employees. He was executing his plan with chilling precision. People who had been casually chatting and completing their business were now thrown into a nightmare of survival. For a brief moment, the room was paralyzed with shock and disbelief. As the people inside the bank looked on in shock and terror, the robber approached the cashier. He demanded money, his voice steady but cold. No one was sure of his intentions until he opened fire. With ruthless precision, the Santa-clad figure shot and killed a bank guard who attempted to stop him. The man fell to the ground, blood staining the marble floor. The robber was far from done. The coldness of the act, the suddenness with which the robber executed it, was chilling. Witnesses later recounted that the Santa Claus robber showed no hesitation, no fear. He was a man on a mission, and nothing was going to stop him. He wasn't interested in the holiday season. He wasn't concerned with joy or peace. His only concern was executing the robbery, and his every action seemed carefully calculated to ensure its success. After murdering the guard, the Santa Claus robber moved quickly, collecting the cash from the tellers and stuffing it into his bag. He moved like a man with a mission, his movements fast and deliberate. It was clear that this was no random act of violence, but a crime planned with chilling precision. The employees and customers of the bank were too terrified to resist. They complied with the robber's demands, afraid that any wrong move would result in more bloodshed. At that moment, Christmas Eve had transformed from a night of celebration into one of horror. The sense of peace that typically accompanies the holiday season had evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming fear. But how did this man, a seemingly ordinary individual, decide to use Christmas as the perfect cover for such a horrifying crime? Was he a seasoned criminal, or was something far more disturbing at play? The police were immediately alerted to the crime, but the robber had a head start. The streets of Stockton were filled with the usual holiday bustle, and the police had no immediate way of identifying the man behind the mask. In a matter of minutes, the Santa Claus robber had disappeared into the night, leaving behind nothing but terror and confusion in his wake. His escape was as swift as his crime, and for a brief time, it seemed as though he would get away with it. The authorities launched an extensive manhunt in the following days, but the robber had vanished without a trace. Witnesses described him as wearing a perfectly fitted Santa suit, complete with a white beard and a red cap, but none could say for certain who he was. It seemed as though the man had come from nowhere, committing a violent act under the cover of Christmas, and then disappearing into the holiday night as if he had never existed. His carefully crafted disguise made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to identify him. Santa Claus had been the perfect cover, and in the chaos of the robbery, the police had little to go on. It wasn't until after the robbery that the bizarre nature of the crime truly began to take shape. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment robbery. This was an act planned meticulously in advance, and it raised questions that linger to this day. The Santa Claus bank robber never made it out alive, but the bizarre twist in this case still lingers today. Why did he choose Christmas for his violent act? Was this truly just a robbery gone wrong, or was there a deeper motive hiding behind the mask of Santa? In the days following the robbery, rumors swirled about the identity of the robber. Was he a local man who had become desperate, or was he a criminal from elsewhere, using the Christmas season to carry out his crime undetected? The mystery surrounding his motives only deepened when it was revealed that the robber had been planning his escape in the most precise and disturbing way. In a final twist, his carefully orchestrated plan fell apart when law enforcement was able to track down a clue, a faint but unmistakable trail left behind by Santa's boots. It was Christmas Eve, 2011, in Redding, California, a small, picturesque suburban town nestled in the northern part of the state. The streets were lined with twinkling lights, and festive decorations adorned nearly every house. The crisp air carried the faint smell of pine and cinnamon, while families hurried about their final preparations for the holiday. Children eagerly awaited the arrival of Santa Claus, while parents busied themselves with last-minute shopping or wrapping presents. The town was alive with holiday cheer, smiling faces, laughter, and the promise of joyful moments ahead. For many in Reading, Christmas Eve was simply another chapter in the season's rituals. The streets were quiet, the only sounds coming from the soft wind rustling the branches of the trees and the occasional honk of a passing car. The calm, idyllic atmosphere, however, would soon be shattered. At one house, the Giselda family, David, Monica, and their 3 young children, was preparing for Christmas. The children, Ryan, Emily, and Ava, were finishing their schoolwork, anxious for the morning to come. Their mother, Monica, was in the kitchen, preparing a final batch of cookies to leave out for Santa. David, the father, was nowhere to be seen for much of the evening. He had locked himself in his room, reportedly staring at the wall, a behavior that had become increasingly familiar in the days leading up to the tragedy. It would be hours before anyone outside the Giselda household would realize that what should have been the happiest time of year was instead a prelude to the most horrific of events. The Giselda family would not see Christmas morning. On December 24, 2011, a tragedy unfolded in the quiet town of Redding, California. A family of 5 was discovered dead in their home, brutally murdered just hours before Christmas morning. But the killer wasn't some stranger. It was the father, 45-year-old David Giselda. David Giselda had always been a seemingly upstanding member of his community. A 45-year-old father of 3, he had a stable job and was seen as the epitome of the suburban American dream. The Giselda family appeared perfect to the outside world: 2 parents, 3 children, a home, and the occasional family outing. David worked as a mechanic, a job that allowed him to provide for his wife Monica and their 3 children. But beneath the surface of this perfect life, cracks had begun to form. David's once easygoing nature had started to change in the months leading up to the murders. He became withdrawn, displaying signs of irritability, paranoia, and anger. In the weeks before Christmas, David's mental state rapidly deteriorated. Friends and family noticed he had become distant and anxious. He would talk erratically about financial trouble, even though there was no evidence to support such claims. Monica, worried about her husband's well-being, tried to get him to seek help, but David resisted. Instead, he grew more agitated. He began isolating himself from his family, locking himself in his room for hours, and often engaging in bizarre conversations about people conspiring against him. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises late at night, arguing, shouting, and sounds that seemed to indicate something was wrong inside the Giselda home. But no one knew the extent of the tension within the family, and David's behavior was becoming more erratic. Friends later mentioned how David had expressed fears of losing his job, though he had a steady income. It was clear that something was eating away at him, but the cause remained elusive. Some speculated that David's growing financial stress, coupled with possible mental illness, was the root of his troubles. But others thought that his mounting paranoia had simply driven him to the edge. That evening, Monica tried to keep up the holiday spirit for their children. They had no idea what was coming. She had arranged a festive Christmas dinner, hoping to ease the tension that had been building over the past few weeks. Her children, Ryan, a 13-year-old teenager with a bright future ahead of him, Emily, a lively 10-year-old girl, and Ava, the youngest at just 7 years old, were excited for Christmas Day. But as the night wore on, David's mood grew darker. At some point, he snapped. In the span of hours, David would go from a father trying to provide for his family to a man capable of horrific violence. It was during the evening hours, as Monica and the children settled in for a quiet night, that David, in a fit of anger, decided to act on his delusions. Whether it was due to financial troubles, his spiraling mental state, or a combination of both, David's motives remain unclear. What is known is that he used a firearm to murder his wife Monica and his 3 children one by one. His methodical actions reflected a chilling, calculated decision to end the lives of his family. David's decision to take the lives of his loved ones was both shocking and incomprehensible. The violence was swift and brutal. He murdered Monica, Ryan, Emily, and Ava with no apparent remorse. After committing the unspeakable act, David turned the gun on himself, ending his own life just hours before Christmas morning. What could drive a man to take the lives of his own family during what is supposed to be a time of love and joy? Was it financial ruin, mental illness, or something even more disturbing? The tragedy went unnoticed until the early morning hours of Christmas Day. A neighbor, concerned that the Giselda family hadn't been seen that evening, went to the house to check on them. When no one answered the door, the neighbor entered the home and discovered the bodies. The scene inside was as horrific as it was incomprehensible. The Giselda family, once a symbol of suburban bliss, had been violently torn apart in their own home just hours before Christmas. The police were called to the scene, and investigators immediately began to piece together the grim details of the massacre. The authorities quickly identified David Giselda as the perpetrator. His motives, however, remained unclear. Despite the investigation into his finances and his mental health, the reasons behind his violent actions were never fully understood. The town of Reading, once so peaceful and quiet, was left reeling from the shock. In a place known for its tranquility and family-oriented values, the murder of an entire family was simply unimaginable. While the investigation did uncover troubling details about David's mental state, the question still remains. What led him to commit such an unfathomable act just days before Christmas? The Griswold family, like many across the country, had been preparing for what should have been a joyous Christmas Eve in 2008. In the sleepy town of Newaygo, Michigan, their home was a picturesque sight, adorned with the usual holiday cheer. Sparkling lights framing the windows, a freshly cut Christmas tree filling the room with the scent of pine. The air was crisp with the promise of snow, and inside, the hum of Christmas carols and the flickering light of candles created a scene of warmth and happiness. But as the Griswold family settled into their cozy holiday plans, their evening would take a nightmarish turn. What began as a celebration would soon become a massacre, turning their peaceful home into a crime scene of horror and confusion. The murder of the Griswold family would be an act of unthinkable violence, one that no one could have predicted, not even in the darkest corners of their minds. It was Christmas Eve 2008, a time meant for family, love, and celebration. But for the Griswold family in Michigan, this night would turn into a horror beyond comprehension. What should have been an evening of joy was abruptly transformed into a scene of violence and terror. The Griswolds became the unsuspecting victims of a brutal, senseless attack that would leave them shattered forever. On December 24, 2008, the Griswold family sat down to their holiday meal, unaware that the next few hours would unfold in a way no one could have ever imagined. Inside their home, the atmosphere was light, filled with the joyous sounds of laughter and excitement. The family had just finished dinner, ready to settle down and enjoy the evening, when the nightmare began. An unknown assailant, a 21-year-old man with no apparent connection to the Griswolds, had been stalking their home. It's unclear how he knew the family's routine or why he chose this particular night. What is certain, however, is that he broke into the Griswold home without warning and without any mercy. The attack was sudden, brutal, and precise, leaving the family with no time to escape or fight back. The mother was the first to fall victim. As she moved about the house preparing for the night, the intruder struck. She was attacked viciously. Before she could even understand what was happening, her life was snuffed out. It was a senseless and shocking murder that sent a chill through the otherwise peaceful home. The children, still young and innocent, were caught in the terror of the moment. One child was critically injured, while another was left physically scarred from the violence. Their screams echoed through the house, piercing the Christmas silence and signaling a nightmare no child should ever have to experience. The father, who had been in the garage, rushed inside when he heard the commotion, but it was too late. By the time he arrived, the damage was done. The brutality of the attack left everyone in the community stunned. Who could do such a thing on Christmas Eve, of all nights? The motive behind the crime was unclear at first. There were no signs of forced entry beyond the break-in and no apparent financial gain to be had. The Griswold family was well liked and had no known enemies, so why had this stranger targeted them? The investigation into the murder began with more questions than answers. There was no indication that the Griswolds had any reason to be attacked. The case left detectives baffled, as there was no obvious reason for such an unimaginable act of violence. It wasn't until later that the killer's identity would be revealed, adding another layer of confusion and disbelief to the already tragic situation. Would a young man with no connection to the Griswold family invade their home on the night of all nights, Christmas Eve? What was his motive? Was it random? Or did he have some twisted reason for targeting this particular family? The answers to these questions would take months to uncover, and the truth would reveal an unsettling reality that no one could have anticipated. The investigation into the grisly crime would continue to unfold, eventually leading to the capture of the perpetrator. But the story would only deepen the mystery surrounding the case. The young man responsible for the murders had no prior criminal history, no apparent motive, and no connection to the Griswolds. His arrest, however, would not answer all the questions. Why did he choose this family, this night, for his twisted act of violence? Even after the arrest, the horror of that Christmas Eve night lingered in the air. The Griswold family, who had once been full of life, was forever scarred by the brutality they endured. They were left to pick up the shattered pieces of their lives in the wake of the attack. The question remains, what drove a young man to carry out such a heinous crime during the most sacred time of the year? Was it truly random violence? Or was there something more disturbing at play? Though the killer was apprehended, the chilling truth behind his motives remains unclear. The Griswold family's Christmas Eve will never be the same. Their world, once filled with joy, will forever be haunted by the violence that shattered their peace. What was the true reason for this holiday horror? Was there something more to this story than meets the eye? The Hinterkaifeck farm in rural Germany, 1922. Christmas was fast approaching, and the Gruber family, like most other families, was preparing for the holiday season. The picturesque farm, tucked away in a secluded area, was surrounded by dense forests, making it feel like a world of its own. The small farmhouse, complete with a barn, stables, and a handful of animals, was a typical country home. The family was small, just 6 members, led by the 63-year-old farmer, Andreas Gruber, his wife, Cecilia, their daughter, Victoria, and her children, 14-year-old Josef and 7-year-old Cecilia, lived together in this isolated farmstead. The Grubers had been preparing for a quiet Christmas together, as they always did, with few neighbors to visit or festivities to attend. They lived an austere, hard-working life, raising livestock and tending to their crops. But little did they know, their final Christmas would also be their last. As the Christmas season arrived, the Grubers had no inkling that their peaceful holiday preparations would soon be overshadowed by one of the most chilling and mysterious murders in German history. The Hinterkaifeck farm was nestled in a remote and isolated part of Bavaria, some 6 kilometers from the nearest village. The location itself seemed to reflect the solitude of the family's existence. Their nearest neighbors were far away, and their life was one of quiet, rural labor. For the Grubers, Christmas was a time to gather together in the warmth of their home and enjoy a break from the harshness of farm life. Yet, in just a matter of days, their lives would be consumed by a horrific act of violence, and their farm would become the site of a chilling mystery that still remains unsolved today. The night of March 31st, 1922 would mark the end of an era for the Gruber family. When the family was found the following morning, the entire community would be stunned by the brutality of the murders and the bizarre circumstances surrounding the case. But it was the fact that the killer had stayed inside the house for days following the murders that would make this case even more unnerving. The Hinterkaifeck murders are one of the most infamous and chilling unsolved crimes in history. On March 31st, 1922, 6 members of the Gruber family were brutally murdered in their home on the isolated Hinterkaifeck farm in Germany. Despite several leads and suspects, the killer was never identified. The discovery of the murders was as bizarre as the crime itself. On the morning of April 1st, 1922, the farm's maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived early to begin her work. She had been hired to help with the household chores, and she was the first to make the grim discovery. As she entered the farmhouse, she noticed an odd stillness inside. The kitchen was eerily quiet, and the family would have been. The children's school bags were still by the door, and everything appeared to be undisturbed. But as Maria ventured further into the house, what she found was nothing short of a nightmare. The bodies of the Gruber family were discovered scattered throughout the farmhouse. The elderly Andreas Gruber had been found dead in his bed, shot in the back of the head. His wife, Kazilia, was found in another part of the house, also murdered. Victoria, their daughter, was discovered in her bed where she had been killed, as well as her 2 children. The younger Kazilia had been murdered alongside her brother, Josef, both of them found in their beds. But the horror didn't stop there. What struck the investigators as particularly disturbing was that the killer seemed to have stayed in the house for several days following the murders. It wasn't just the brutal killings that left everyone in shock. It was the eerie nature of the crime's aftermath. The murderer did not flee the scene immediately. Instead, it seemed the killer had gone about their business with disturbing calmness, using the Gruber's tools and feeding their animals. The killer, it appeared, had spent days inside the farmhouse as if they were a member of the family. Despite the brutality of the crime, there were no signs of forced entry into the house. The door had been left unlocked, as it often was, and the windows were undisturbed. The killer was able to walk into the house with ease, as though they knew the family's routines and had some degree of familiarity with the place. It was almost as if the murderer had been living among the Grubers, silently waiting until the opportune moment to strike. One of the most chilling aspects of the crime was that neighbors reported hearing strange noises in the days following the murders. The sounds of footsteps and other movements in and around the farm were heard, yet no one suspected anything out of the ordinary. The killer had managed to stay hidden, moving within the shadows of the house, tending to the animals, and using the tools without arousing suspicion. The fact that no one thought anything was wrong until the maid arrived was baffling. Could the killer have been someone close to the family? A relative, perhaps? Or could it have been an outsider who knew the farm well? Someone who was familiar with the layout and routines? The crime seemed so personal, yet the killer was methodical, almost invisible. How could someone have committed such a brutal act and stayed inside for days without anyone noticing? As word of the murders spread throughout the surrounding area, investigators were immediately dispatched to the scene. What they uncovered in the following days only deepened the mystery. The local police were at a loss for how to proceed, especially considering the bizarre nature of the crime and the lack of any definitive leads. A thorough investigation of the farmhouse turned up no substantial clues. The killer's identity remained a mystery, Initially, suspicion fell on several people in the nearby village, but no solid evidence ever emerged to connect any of them to the crime. The family had few enemies, and those who had known the Grubers described them as relatively well-liked. However, the most intriguing lead came from a statement made by Victoria's daughter, Cecilia. In the days before her death, she claimed to have seen a man lurking near the barn, but when authorities investigated, they found no trace of anyone matching the description. Despite multiple leads, the killer's identity was never uncovered. Over time, theories arose about who the murderer could have been, with some suspecting an internal family dispute, others pointing to a possible disgruntled worker or local acquaintance. Even a relative of the Grubers was suspected, but no one could be conclusively linked to the crime. The lack of any reliable evidence left the case unsolved, and the town was left in fear and confusion, wondering if the killer would ever be found. To this day, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of the darkest, most perplexing unsolved crimes in history. The mystery of who killed the Gruber family and why continues to haunt the minds of those who study this chilling case. The bizarre nature of the crime, combined with the killer's eerie behavior and the lack of a clear motive, keeps the investigation alive, with new theories and speculations regularly emerging. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of the darkest, most perplexing unsolved crimes in history. Will we ever know the truth behind this horrific Christmas tragedy? Christmas may be a time for family, for joy, for togetherness, but for some, it is a time for horror. These 5 real-life murders serve as a stark reminder that not all holiday stories are wrapped in warmth and cheer. Some are wrapped in blood, fear, and mystery. The holiday season is often synonymous with peace, love, and family gatherings. But for the victims in these chilling stories, Christmas became the backdrop for horrific violence. From the gruesome killings of the Lawson family in North Carolina, to the violent bank robbery by a Santa impersonator, and the haunting mystery of the Hinterkaifeck murders in Germany, these real-life events remind us that evil can strike when we least expect it, even during what should be the most joyous time of the year. What drives someone to commit such unthinkable acts during a season meant for goodwill? The motives behind these murders remain as haunting as the crimes themselves. Whether driven by mental illness, financial desperation, or something darker, the killer's actions left behind a trail of unanswered questions and shattered lives. For the families and communities affected, the joy of Christmas was forever tainted. The memories of these brutal crimes continue to haunt the towns and villages where they occurred, and the victims' stories live on as stark reminders that no one is immune to tragedy. The next time you hear the sound of jingle bells or see the twinkling lights of a Christmas tree, remember that darkness can sometimes be lurking right under the surface. These cases serve as a chilling reminder that while many celebrate Christmas with love and warmth, for others, it's a time of unimaginable horror. If you found these stories haunting, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more true crime documentaries. Stay safe and keep your loved ones close.